Hubby made me a cup of coffee which had a very strange smell. "Made you a special coffee, honey," he said. I answered, "How sweet," and quietly swapped the mugs with my sister-in-law, who always bullied me. 30 minutes later, "Don't you want to try the coffee I made especially for you, honey?" my husband James asked with an odd smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I was sitting at my sister-in-law Nina's elegant dining table in her Nashville home where we gathered for our monthly family brunch. The coffee cup in front of me had a strange, almost metallic smell that made my stomach turn. My name is Christina, and at 29, I never imagined I'd be questioning whether my own husband was trying to poison me. But after 3 years of marriage and countless incidents of accidental food poisoning, I had learned to be cautious, especially around Nina. She had a way of orchestrating situations that left me sick or humiliated, always with that same innocent smile James was wearing now. "How thoughtful of you," I replied, forcing a smile while my mind raced. The aroma wafting from the cup was unlike any coffee I'd smelled before. It reminded me of the time last month when I'd ended up in urgent care after drinking tea at Nina's house. The doctors couldn't explain my symptoms, and Nina had insisted she'd made the tea exactly the same way she made her own. Nina watched me intently from across the table, absently stirring her own untouched coffee. "James has become quite the barista lately," she said with a smirk. "He's been practicing different brewing methods just for you." The way she emphasized "for you" sent chills down my spine. I had noticed James spending more time at Nina's house lately, claiming they were planning a surprise for our upcoming anniversary. But something felt off. The whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the strange text I'd glimpsed on his phone, and now this coffee with its peculiar scent. I lifted the cup, pretending to take a sip while studying their expressions. James and Nina exchanged a quick glance that confirmed my suspicions. Making a show of checking my phone, I stood up abruptly. "Oh, would you look at that? I need to make a quick call for work. Nina, would you mind if I use your study?" As I walked past Nina's place setting, I deliberately stumbled, quickly switching our coffee cups in the confusion of steadying myself. "I'm so sorry," I exclaimed, straightening up. "I'm such a klutz sometimes." Nina waved off my apology with a tight smile. "Just try not to break anything in the study." I nodded and hurried away, my heart pounding. Through the study's doorway, I could still see them at the table. Now I just had to wait and watch. From the study doorway, I watched Nina lift the coffee cup to her lips, and my stomach clenched with anxiety. Part of me wanted to stop her, to warn her, but I needed to know the truth. I'd spent too many nights in emergency rooms, too many hours doubled over in pain, always after sharing meals with them. It wasn't always like this. When I first met James at a friend's wedding in Nashville 3 years ago, he was charming and attentive. Nina had seemed welcoming too, inviting me to family gatherings and offering to help plan our wedding. But looking back, I should have noticed the red flags. The way she would accidentally spill things on my dress at important events, or how my food always seemed to have extra seasoning when she helped cook. The incident started small. An upset stomach here, a mild allergic reaction there. James always had an excuse ready. "Maybe it was something you ate earlier, or you must be coming down with something." But the pattern was becoming clear. The worst was 2 months ago when I ended up hospitalized after eating breakfast at their house. The doctors found traces of something in my system they couldn't identify. But James convinced everyone I must have taken some expired medication. I gripped the doorframe, watching as Nina took another sip of the coffee. James was typing on his phone, seemingly unconcerned. My own untouched cup sat cold on the table where I'd left it. The metallic smell still lingered in my nose, making me shudder. A slight tremor in Nina's hand caught my attention. She set down the cup, her face suddenly pale. "James," she said, her voice shaking. "Something's wrong." James looked up, his expression changing from confusion to horror as he realized which cup she was drinking from. He jumped up, knocking over his chair. "Nina, what's happening?" Nina's hands were trembling violently now. I feel she tried to stand but stumbled, grabbing the edge of the table for support. "James, what did you put in that coffee?" I stepped out of the study, my phone already recording. James was beside Nina now, his face ashen. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup," he whispered. But in the silence of the dining room, his words carried clearly. Nina's eyes widened with realization and fear. "Call an ambulance," she gasped, sliding to the floor. "Please, I can't." I dialed 911 immediately, my hands steady despite the chaos unfolding before me. Nina was on the floor now, her body racked with violent tremors. James knelt beside her, panic written across his face as he realized their plan had backfired spectacularly. "Emergency services?" "Yes. We need an ambulance at 1542 Maple Grove Drive," I said clearly, keeping my phone recording with my other hand. "My sister-in-law appears to be having a severe reaction to something in her coffee. She's conscious, but experiencing tremors." As I spoke to the dispatcher, Nina's eyes locked onto mine. The usual cold calculation in her gaze was replaced by raw fear. "Christina," she gasped. "You switched, you knew?" "Ma'am, the ambulance is on its way," the dispatcher assured me. "Please stay on the line." James was growing more frantic by the second. "Nina, what's happening? That wasn't supposed to, it wasn't meant for." "Shut up, James." Nina snapped through gritted teeth, her anger momentarily overcoming her distress. "This is all your fault. You said it would just make her sick enough to miss the board meeting next week. You promised it wouldn't be traced." My blood ran cold. The board meeting, where I was scheduled to present my proposal for a major client account, the same account Nina had been trying to land for months at our competing firms. Everything started clicking into place. "The tea last month," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "And the breakfast incident 2 months ago, those weren't accidents, were they?" Nina's face contorted with another wave of pain. "The tea that was supposed to keep you home during the Johnson contract presentation, but you went anyway." She clutched her stomach, doubling over. "James said, he said we just needed to discredit you, make clients think you were unreliable." The sound of sirens filled the air outside. James stood up, backing away from both of us. "Nina, stop talking. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Nina spat, her words slurring slightly. "We've been planning this for months, ever since Christina started outperforming me at every client meeting. You were supposed to make sure she drank it today." The paramedics burst through the front door, and I quickly stepped aside to let them work. As they loaded Nina onto a stretcher, I stopped recording and sent the video to my private email, then to my lawyer. James stood frozen, watching as his carefully constructed plan crumbled around him. "I'll ride with her to the hospital," I told the paramedics, my voice firm. "After all, I need to make sure my sister-in-law gets the proper treatment." I met James's terrified gaze, and I'm sure the doctors will be very interested in knowing exactly what was in that coffee. The emergency room at Nashville General Hospital was a flurry of activity as doctors rushed to treat Nina. I sat in the waiting room, my phone clutched in my hand, replaying the recording of Nina's confession. The tremors in her voice, the panic in her eyes. It was all the evidence I needed to prove this wasn't just paranoia on my part. "Family of Nina Anderson?" a nurse called out. I stood up, noting James's conspicuous absence. He'd mumbled something about parking the car 20 minutes ago and hadn't returned. "I'm her sister-in-law," I said, following the nurse through the double doors. "How is she?" "She stabilized, but we found concerning levels of toxins in her system." The nurse's expression was grave. "The doctor would like to speak with you about some unusual findings in her blood work." Dr. Phillips, a tall woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, was waiting by Nina's room. "Mrs. Bennett, could you tell me exactly what happened before your sister-in-law became ill?" I took a deep breath, pulling out my phone. "I think you should listen to this first." I played the recording from brunch, watching the doctor's expression change from professional concern to alarm. "This is very serious," she said, making notes on her tablet. "The substance we found isn't something that accidentally ends up in coffee. We're looking at deliberate contamination." Just then James appeared at the end of the hallway, his face pale and sweaty. He'd clearly overheard the doctor's words. "Christina," he started, taking a step toward me. "Let me explain." "Stay back," Dr. Phillips warned, pressing the nurse's call button. "Security to room 412, please." James raised his hands in surrender. "This is all a misunderstanding." Nina was confused. She didn't know what she was saying. "Really?" I pulled up the text I discovered on his phone last week, the ones I'd secretly forwarded to myself. "So these messages between you and Nina about making sure she's out of commission before the Henderson presentation were just friendly conversation." His face drained of color. "You went through my phone after I found the strange pills in your desk drawer?" "Yes, I did." I turned to Dr. Phillips. "Doctor, I've been hospitalized 3 times in the past 6 months with unexplained symptoms. I'd like to know if they match what you found in Nina's system today." The doctor's eyes narrowed. "We'll need to run some tests to compare. Security will make sure your husband remains available for questioning." 2 security guards appeared, positioning themselves on either side of James. He looked trapped, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. "Nina and I," he stammered. "We were just trying to help you slow down. You were working too hard, taking all the big clients. Nina said if we could just make you take some time off." "By poisoning me?" My voice was steady, even as my hands shook with rage. "How long have you been doing this? Was it you who tampered with my food at the Christmas party too?" James's silence was all the answer I needed. Behind him, I could see Nina's room, where she lay connected to various monitors. Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced by the fear of someone who knew their schemes had finally caught up with them. "Detective Mendoza is on her way," Dr. Phillips said quietly. "She'll want to take statements from everyone involved." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm. The truth was finally coming out, and there was no going back. Detective Mendoza arrived within the hour, her presence commanding attention in the sterile hospital corridor. She was a seasoned investigator who specialized in domestic abuse cases, and she listened intently as I played the recording from brunch and showed her the text messages. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, reviewing her notes. "You mentioned previous hospitalizations. Can you tell me more about those incidents?" I pulled out my phone again, opening a document I'd been quietly maintaining for months. The first time was in February after a dinner at Nina's house. I had severe stomach pains and dizziness. The second was in April, the tea incident, and then in June after breakfast with them. My voice remained steady as I continued. Each time the symptoms were similar, but just different enough that the doctors couldn't pinpoint a cause. The detective's eyes narrowed as she looked at my detailed log of dates, symptoms, and circumstances. "And you've been keeping records?" "Ever since I noticed the pattern." I hesitated before pulling out another phone from my purse. I also started carrying a backup phone with a different number. I used it to record conversations when I was around them. I have several where Nina and James discuss their plans, though they're careful not to be explicit. In one of the recordings, Nina's voice came through clearly. "The Henderson account is worth millions, James. We can't let her ruin everything we've worked for. Just stick to the plan. A few days of illness should be enough." James's response was equally damning. "I've got something stronger this time. She won't make it to the presentation." Detective Mendoza's expression hardened as she listened. Through the window of Nina's room, I could see my sister-in-law was now awake, looking significantly less confident than she had at brunch. "The hospital is running toxicology screens," the detective informed me. "Dr. Phillips has already identified several substances that don't occur naturally. We'll need samples from your home as well." A commotion down the hall caught our attention. James was arguing with the security guards, his voice rising in desperation. "I need to speak with my wife," he shouted. "Christina, please, you don't understand. We were trying to protect you." Detective Mendoza stepped between us. "Mr. Bennett, you're not helping your case. We've already found evidence of premeditated. James laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the corridor. "We were just trying to slow her down. She was working herself to death, taking all the major accounts. Nina said if we could just make her take some time off, by poisoning her." Detective Mendoza's voice was sharp. "That's not protection, Mr. Bennett. That's attempted murder." The color drained from James's face. "Murder? No. That's not, we never meant to." "Then what exactly did you mean to do?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. "When you put something in my coffee this morning, what was supposed to happen?" James's silence spoke volumes. Behind him, I could see Nina watching through her hospital room window, her face a mask of fear and calculation. I wondered if she was trying to figure out how to spin this, how to explain away months of systematic poisoning as some sort of misguided attempt at helping me. "We'll need both of their phones," Detective Mendoza told the security guards, "and I want officers posted at both doors. Nobody leaves until we get the toxicology results." Dr. Phillips entered Nina's room with a tablet in hand, her expression grim as she reviewed the test results. Detective Mendoza and I followed while James remained outside with the guards. Nina tried to sit up straighter in her hospital bed, but the tremors hadn't completely subsided. "The toxicology report shows elevated levels of several substances," Dr. Phillips announced, her voice clinical. "Most concerning is the presence of a particular compound that's typically used in pharmaceutical testing. It's not something the general public should have access to." Nina's face paled. "That's impossible. James said it was just something to cause mild symptoms." "Mild symptoms?" Detective Mendoza interrupted, taking out her notebook. "Like the ones your sister-in-law experienced over the past 6 months?" The door opened and another detective entered holding an evidence bag. "We found these in Mr. Bennett's office desk at the Anderson marketing firm," he reported, presenting several small bottles with clinical labels, along with detailed notes about dosages and reactions. I felt my knees weaken as I realized the full scope of their plan. "You were documenting everything, like some kind of experiment?" "It wasn't like that," Nina protested, but her voice wavered. "We just needed to track what worked. The first few attempts weren't effective enough. You kept showing up to meetings anyway. So you increased the dosages," Detective Mendoza concluded, examining the bottles. "Did you know these substances could be lethal in higher concentrations?" The room fell silent. James, still visible through the window, sank into a chair in the hallway, his head in his hands. "The Henderson account?" I said slowly, pieces clicking into place. "It wasn't just about that presentation, was it? You needed me out of the way permanently because the client specifically requested me as their lead." Nina's face contorted with a mixture of anger and fear. "You were ruining everything. I built that client portfolio for years, and then you show up and suddenly everyone wants to work with you instead. James said he could fix it." "By killing me?" The words hung in the air heavy with accusation. "We weren't trying to," Nina started, but Dr. Phillips cut her off. "The concentration in the coffee you drank today, the doctor stated, looking directly at Nina, was significantly higher than previous samples we've analyzed from Mrs. Bennett's earlier hospital visits. If she had consumed it, the outcome would have been severe, possibly fatal. Detective Mendoza turned to the other officer. We'll need a full warrant for both their homes and offices, and contact the pharmaceutical company listed on these bottles. Find out how they obtained these substances. Nina slumped back against her pillows, the fight draining from her face. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she whispered. James kept saying we just needed one more try. I stepped closer to her bed, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. Every time I got sick, every meeting I missed, every client I lost, you were both there watching, taking notes on how your poison was affecting me. What kind of people does that make you? The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, I could hear James being read his rights as additional officers arrived. Nina stared at her hands, unable to meet my gaze. Detective, I said, turning away from my sister-in-law. I'm ready to make my formal statement now. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but it felt like years. I sat in the courtroom each day watching as the prosecution methodically laid out their case against James and Nina. The evidence was overwhelming. The bottles from James's office, their detailed notes on each poisoning attempt, the recorded conversations, and text messages discussing their plans. What struck me most was their demeanor throughout the proceedings. Nina, usually so polished and confident, looked small in her defendant's chair. James couldn't even look at me, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor as expert witnesses detailed the potentially lethal effects of the substances they'd been using. Dr. Phillips's testimony was particularly damning. She presented a comprehensive analysis showing how they had gradually increased the dosages over time, demonstrating clear intent to cause serious harm. The pharmaceutical company representative confirmed that James had stolen the compounds through his college friend who worked in their research department. The defendants showed a calculated pattern of behavior, the prosecutor argued in her closing statement. This wasn't just corporate sabotage. It was a systematic attempt to harm Mrs. Bennett, with a clear escalation that could have resulted in death. When the verdict was finally read, I felt no joy, only relief. Both James and Nina were found guilty on multiple counts, including attempted murder and conspiracy. The judge's words echoed through the silent courtroom. The premeditated nature of these actions, carried out against a family member over an extended period, demands the maximum sentence. I watched as they were led away in handcuffs, thinking about how greed and jealousy had twisted two people I once trusted into something unrecognizable. Their business, their reputations, their freedom, all sacrificed in an attempt to destroy me. 1 year after the trial, I stood at the podium of the Nashville Business Leaders Conference, preparing to give the keynote speech. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was exactly the kind of opportunity Nina had tried to prevent me from achieving. The Henderson account, which she and James had been so desperate to steal, had led to several more major clients, establishing me as one of the top marketing executives in the region. Success isn't just about talent or hard work, I began, looking out at the sea of faces. It's about integrity, about building genuine relationships based on trust. I paused, letting my words sink in. Sometimes the biggest threats to our success come from those closest to us, but surviving those challenges makes us stronger. After my speech, several young professionals approached me seeking advice. One woman, her eyes bright with determination, asked how I'd maintained my composure throughout the ordeal. I focused on what I could control, I told her. I gathered evidence, trusted my instincts, and refused to let fear stop me from pursuing my goals. Later that evening, I received an email from the Henderson client confirming they were renewing their contract for another 3 years. I smiled, thinking about how differently things might have turned out if I hadn't trusted my instincts that day at brunch. The local paper had run a small article that morning about Nina and James beginning their prison sentences. I didn't read it. Instead, I focused on the proposal for my newest client project, knowing that the best revenge wasn't about getting even. It was about moving forward and succeeding despite those who tried to hold you back.